Let's show how we can create selections, how we can take a selection from one document to another, and just some of these other miscellaneous selection methods. So to start with, I'm going to do a file, and I'm going to do an open, and I'm going to open a couple other documents. Let's open the crown, and I can control click to select multiple images and choose open, and they both will open. Okay, now I don't have my tabbed view because I like to have these things floating. I'm going to just slide my layers a little bit over. We still want this to be on top. This is our primary panel that we're going to be looking at. And for these, I'm going to just decrease. I'm going to grab the corner of the window, decrease it down. I don't need to see the whole thing at the moment, and kind of just tuck it behind. All right, so if I want this crown to be part of my cow picture, the, I guess, most simplest way is if I want the whole thing, I'm just going to click my move tool and move it right in. Okay, so there it is. It's in my document, and you can see that my panel now indicates I have two layers, my layer panel. Okay, so that's one way. I'm going to delete this because we're going to clean it up before we bring it over. So I can use some of my tools. The marquee tool, probably not going to work the best because it's just going to make a square around it. So that's probably not my method. Let's look at my favorite, the quick selection tool. So the quick selection tool is a way that Photoshop assumes it knows what you're trying to select. And again, we can change our brush size up at the top. We have some different brush sizes that we can select within a range here. And what I'm going to do is just start clicking, and I can click and drag. And you can see, it's maybe a little difficult to see my marching ants, but you can see where my selections are going. Okay, and now the points of this crown get a little bit small, so I probably will have to change my size down just a smidge. I'll use my square bracket. I'll use the left square bracket, so that's the one right after the letter P on my keyboard. And now I can click in some of these areas. Now, one other thing you want to make sure, if you're doing what I'm doing where I'm clicking after, you want to make sure up here in the options that you have the plus, which indicates I'm always adding to the current selection. If this wasn't selected, every time I click, I would get a new selection. It wouldn't remember what was already selected. So this is doing a pretty good job. Some of these areas that get a little tricky are the ones that, you know, I'm close to my background in. So there I got a little bit, oh, see now I got too much white. So this one's a little bit tricky to do. I'm going to do a Control D to deselect. Whenever you look at stock photography, it's always a good idea to look at stock photography on a solid white background, because that allows us to click the white and then do an inverse. So let's do that. Let's select the white, which is super easy. I don't even have to be very cautious or careful because it's just white. Now my white is selected. I need to have my crown selected. So again, I'm going to go under my select menu, because select has everything to do with my selections, and I'm going to choose inverse. So now my crown is selected. Right, so now you have to think of, if I want to bring something from one document to the other, I have to move it. What tool should I use? The move tool. So I'm going to use the move tool, click, I get a little scissor, good icon, tells me that I'm going to cut it. Looks like looks like I lost part of my crown too. I am going to drag it over, scissor, I get a plus, I let up, and there is my crown. Let's just minimize this for a moment. Okay, so I'm going to have to do a little bit of transformations, probably a little bit of a scale to bring this down. I'll show you a quick tip here. I'm going to extend this so you can see that it's, you know, it's kind of fallen off. So while I have my move tool selected up at the top, I get an option to turn on show transform controls. Let's turn that on. I get a bounding box now that I'm able to adjust. Whenever you're adjusting though, it's always a good idea to hold that shift key, because the shift key, again, constrains the proportions. And this is important because you don't want to distort this. If I didn't hold the shift key, watch what happens. I squash it, or I make it really tall. Maybe not a big deal with a crown, but when you're talking about people, people don't like to get squashed, typically. All right, so I could, in this case, I'm trying to fit it on my cow. So, I could do something like this and call it good. And I'm going to use my checkbox up here. I'm up at the top to say, yep, apply. Now, if the bounding box really bothers you, just turn it off again because you'll see that. Okay, so that's one way that I can bring this over. Now, let's zoom in. All right, this one actually came in fairly clean. Sometimes what happens is you get a jagged edge around. It's called a halo, and that happens because of the selection and what we call anti-aliasing that's going on. I'm just going to show you underneath the select menu, there are ways that we can play with our selection. Now, because I've deselected it already, it's not selected. So instead, I'm going to show you how to reselect this. Because it's on its own layer, I control key and click on that thumbnail, and now I get my active selection. Now let's go to select. So here are some ways that we can change or play around with our selections. I can modify this. So I can play around with smoothing it, expanding it, contracting it, all kinds of fun things. I also can do a refine edge, and this just helps to improve the quality of my selection. And it can get a little advanced. So these are things that, again, we cover in much more of the advanced classes because it gets a bit tricky, but you certainly can play around with it. You can see, that's what happened when I played. This was a pretty decent selection, so I really don't need to play around. Feather would soften the edges a smidge. Sometimes that's what you need to do, especially with hair. And you can play around with the shift edge, you can play with the contrast, smooth things out, all kinds of fun stuff here. Okay, so I'm going to cancel that. All right, so that was the refine edge. We also have a way, if I do have that halo, like I was mentioning earlier. Now, one would think this is under the select menu, but it's not. For whatever reason, it's under the layer menu. And I'm going to actually deselect this time. Control D to deselect. You can see that my crown is on its own layer. I can turn it on, turn it off. I'm zoomed in right now, so I'm seeing quite a bit of it. I'm going to go under layer, and it's under matting, and it's called defringe, and I think that it's probably running off the page right now for you. But at the very bottom, matting and defringe. I'll click on it because this is what pops up. So I can defringe, and basically it replaces the fringe area right where my cursor is going. And I can do this from 1 to 200 pixels. Okay, so it's just replacing it. It's kind of a faking. If I were to have a halo here, you can see maybe a little bit right here. I could defringe this by maybe 4 pixels, and it takes the pixels that are just inside and just recolors them. All right, you can see it happen a little bit. It actually grew because it took 4 pixels out on that edge. You see the difference there? So sometimes that's what you need to do to cheat so that it appears as though it's a clean selection without a halo. All right, let's zoom out. So I'm going to use my Control space bar along with the Alt key and zoom out. One more way that we can make a selection and move it. I'm going to click this flower. All right, so flower is up. So besides the selection tools that we have, we can also select by color range. So under the selection menu, we are going to go to color range. This allows us to sample up a specific color and create a selection from that specific color. And so for this, I could try the yellow, and you can see in my little preview what's happening, what's getting selected. Fuzziness is like a tolerance. So if I'm more tolerant or more fuzzy, more of it's going to get selected. Okay? Now this actually here, I can change this to see the image or the selection. Now, seeing the image does me no good because I need to see what I'm selecting. Okay, so increase the fuzziness. You can see how that grows. All right, so it's a little tricky. because I have so many different colors in my yellows, and now I have the inside here that I can try to select, and I can add increase my selection with my little plus icon here to add. This is still going to be a bit tricky. But looking at this, again, I have a solid white background. Why don't we click on that? So let's click on the white. Let's take my fuzziness down because I don't want to be tolerant at all. Actually, we want to get rid of that plus. It was trying to add to what I had. All right, so here it is. What's selected is all my white. Let's do an invert. Let's click OK. And now just my flower is selected. So again, I can do the move tool, click and move it over. Whoa, it's huge. Okay, so this sometimes happens where the resolution was different. So I'm going to zoom back a bit. And when I click on my show transform controls, this is actually the size of my flower. So let's grab a corner, hold my shift key, and if it's falling off just like it's doing, I let up on my shift key and I click right in the middle. Don't click on the little anchor here because that's just going to move where I'm transforming it around or about. It's my sort of point of origin. So click in somewhere, and now let's use my space and control key to zoom in just a bit. Let's scale this down. All right, and we can put just a little flower on his crown. All right, I'm going to now apply this because I've done some transformations with my shift holding on to the bounding box, so it's transformed, and I need to say, yep, this is what I want. So the check mark at the top, and then I can uncheck my show transform control so I don't see that bounding box, and there it is. Okay, one last way that you can bring graphics in is with a file and a place. So I can place linked or I can place embedded. Linked will bring that document and save it in this file. I'm sorry, embedded will bring it in and save it in this file. Linked will link it out. So I always have to have the two files travel together, otherwise I lose my link and I can't find what I brought in. I can't find that picture, that image. So it's best to embed. However, embedding will increase file size. All right, so a lot of different ways now that you can create a selection and kind of composite. We're starting to composite and compose these images.